Hey guys, this is Thomas, and welcome back to Stylized Station. Here on the channel, I believe that education should be accessible to anyone, and that sharing knowledge is one of the best ways we can all grow. With that in mind, I'm thrilled to have our talented friend Máté joining us today to break down their stunning 3D environment. Let's dive into the process and learn some valuable tips along the way.
Hello, I'm Máté Varga, a 3D generalist and environment artist. I'm excited and happy to share my latest personal project here on the channel. The goal of this work was to jump back into Unreal Engine after a long time not using it, refresh my memory on the environment creation process, and also try out some of the new features that Unreal Engine 5 has to offer. I also tried a couple new techniques along the way that I wasn't using before, like sculpting and utilizing detail maps for some of the larger assets, and creating custom trim sheets that I can use in the structures and also on the props. Inspirations came from many different games, concepts, and mainly the architecture and the nomad lifestyle of the Star Wars universe, especially the atmosphere, lighting, and materials that we can see on Tatooine. What I knew that I wanted to create a smaller temple-like structure that is located in the desert. From the references, I also started thinking about surfaces, materials, and colors. The bathhouse theme wasn't planned originally. It was an idea that came during the Blockout process. Once I had a rough idea in my head, I started working on the Blockout. I use Blender for the modeling and early concepts. I often find it difficult to create interesting enough shapes when I'm trying to make every piece fit into a modular workflow or follow the grid. So my process was, let's focus first on the overall picture and then try to break it down into pieces that can be reused or fit into a modular workflow. After I had a very basic blockout, I did a simple overpaint in Photoshop of some of the details I had in my mind. This helped me a lot when I was getting into the more detailed modeling. Once I felt like I have enough pieces to start building, I moved all my assets into Unreal, and that's when the fun began. This building and kit bashing process is where a lot of the new ideas come to light. Like, what about using this wall piece I originally designed over there would look over here? Or using these pillars in some other places? And also at this point I can see where do I need more building pieces or any extra details. It is a back and forth between modeling and kit bashing until I feel like the foundation of the space makes sense. After the initial blockout, I felt like there is something missing from the middle, and this is when the pool idea came. This also changed the theme a bit from this space being a temple to be more like a bathhouse, which I really liked because that can also bring some life into this very yellow, sandy desert scene. And at a later stage, it also helped me to think about props and set dressing. What is this place used for? What kind of assets I'm going to need to make this place a bit more lived in. Once I finished the blockout, I started turning the building blocks into final pieces. Some of them only required unwrapping, while others needed some modeling for extra details, or creating a sculpted damaged version that I can use to bake down those extra details and normal maps. So next I'm going to show you my workflow on how I created the sculpted details for some of the pieces. The method I used for this is pretty simple. It is a high poly, low poly workflow for the first part, and the final models have two UV channels that I use in the shaders. One is for the tileable materials and trim textures, and the other one is for detail normals and some of the detail masks like edge wear, dirt, and color variation. The cool thing about this workflow is that you can have a tileable material for the large pieces as a base and still add some extra details on top of that. So the first step was creating a base model, and as you can see, I only created a couple of pieces, not the whole shape. I did that for two reasons. One is to save time on the sculpting, and the other one is to save some UV space for the detailed textures. I did the sculpting in ZBrush, and actually it was my first time trying to sculpt something for a project, so I'm not an expert by any means. But this seemed like a perfect start, since I only had to do some basic edge damage and details. For the brushes, I mainly used the built-in trim brushes and the fantastic brush set made by Michael Vicente, aka Orb. These brushes were really useful for a beginner like me, so I highly recommend it. And here you can see some of the final sculpted high poly meshes. Once I finished sculpting, I imported the pieces back to Blender and separated them from each other to not have any issues during the baking. After that, I made a low poly version of my original model, unwrapped this to a UV0 space, and I baked everything down to that one in Substance Painter. Then I just created some RGB masks for my dirt and edge highlight. I created a smart material that later I could reuse in all of the assets. And as you can see, I also tried introducing some stylized painted-like textures into those masks, so it would create some interesting color variation in the final asset. I used the red channel for my dirt and the green channel for my highlighted parts. After the baking was done, I assembled the final shape and created another UV channel for the tileable textures and the trim sheets. So this is one of the master materials I have. I'm using this setup for almost everything in the environment, and I'm going to try to explain on a high level what's going on here, so you have a rough idea how these detail masks are used in the material. So for the base material, I'm blending between two texture sets. One is labeled with the orange and the other one is labeled with this blue. So I'm doing a height blend between those two texture sets. And it is important to note that the base textures are using my first UV channel, which is labeled by the texture coordinate 0. And once these two texture sets are blended together, then I'm introducing the detail masks into the base color, into the roughness, and also to the normal map. So I am bringing in my mask map with the texture coordinate 1, which is my second UV channel. So I'm using the red channel for the dirt and the green channel for the edge highlight. This part is for the base color. I'm just blending in colors with those masks into the dirt and also to the edge. I'm also controlling the roughness channels with these masks. And I'm also blending my detail normal map into the base normal map with the same second UV channel. After everything is blended together, I'm adding an object-based gradient so I can further stylize some of the assets. So let me show you how this whole setup works in action, so it will make a bit more sense. So in my material instance, I have my base material with all the textures and controls here. I also have my blended material parameters with the textures and the same controls. And I have this blend mask, which is responsible for blending these two materials together. I'm using the vertex paint combined with some extra texture details. Let me show you how this actually functions. If we go into Mesh Paint, select the paint, I'm using the red channel for this, so I can just start painting and revealing the underlying texture. And what's cool about this is, since I have this extra texture that is blended with my vertex paint, I can either switch this to be a different texture, change the opacity of the effect, also change the scale or the contrast. So this is with the texture detail, and this is what it would look like without the texture detail. As for the gradient, I have two colors. One drives the top part and the other one the bottom. We can change this to, let's say, a darker color, and we can offset the gradient, change the power of the gradient, and also the scale of the effect. And for the detail masks, I have some controls of the overall opacity of the dirt and also to the edge. And I can also change the color of those areas for my liking. I only needed a handful of tileable materials, and I made them in Substance Designer. I wanted to go for a stylized look, so I knew I have to avoid adding a lot of high frequency details. I also wanted to have a painted look, so for that I created a brush pattern using some simple shapes with the tile sampler, and I distorted this with a couple noise patterns. And that was the starting point for all my base colors. For the trim texture, I first modeled the pattern in Blender, added some extra decals like bolts, panels on top of that. Then I baked down the normal maps and the color mask with the simple bake add-on. Then I used these textures as an input in Substance Designer. I converted my normal to a height map, added some distortion to make it a bit less perfect looking, then used the same brushed pattern for the base color. I also used these in the roughness channels, which boosted this effect even more. I really like the extra variations that this method added to my roughness channel in the final material. I used this trim sheet on some of my props as well to quickly add some extra details. For the pool, I started creating my own water shader, but I wasn't satisfied with the results, so in the end I replaced it with a really cool and customizable shader from an asset pack. For the props, I also tried to go for a stylized approach, utilizing painted texture masks and gradients. For the fabrics, I used the subsurface material to have that soft, translucent feel when the sun shines to them from the backside. For the large pieces, I used Unreal's cloth simulation combined with a wind force in the scene. For the smaller pieces, I just used some wind in the shaders to add some slight movement. I also used decals to add even more variation and details to the larger surfaces. And to add some more ground detail, I created these small sand pies that I placed in some of the corners. To make a softer blend with the other assets, I used this simple node setup for the pixel depth offset. Adding the props and those small details to the scene really started to tie the space together. This part always gives me an extra boost towards completing the project. For the fallback of the environment, I didn't have a plan for a long time, So I had this idea to open it up and have the desert peek in a bit. For that I used a couple of Megascan assets for the rocks, with a slight modification in their shader to have this brighter sand layer on the top. And I added some of the props and assets I already made to fill up this space. The lighting setup is very simple and straightforward. A directional light with a skylight and a sky atmosphere, and I also have a volumetric cloud and fog in the scene. I tried to do a basic setup for the lighting in the early Blockout stage, so I have an idea of the composition for my hero shot and an overall mood of the scene. Towards the end, these basic settings seemed to be a bit too yellow and monochrome for my liking, so I wanted to play with the colors a bit. First, I adjusted my skylight to use a specified HDRI instead of the real-time scene capture. I have boosted the intensity and added a blue tint to it. This already changed a lot by adding a cooler color to some areas. I also played with some settings in the sky atmosphere, and my favorite one is the relay scattering. Adjusting this can dramatically change the feel of the lighting. And at last I did some small color adjustments in the post-processing and also added a lot with a very small intensity. I also used a couple effects from the Unreal's starter content, like the fire in the braziers, some fog sheets with a low opacity, and the light beam to boost the volumetric effects around the skylights. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Looking back at the overall picture, there are some parts I will probably do differently or try to improve. For example, I could do a better job with the prop variety or create something more specific that tells a story of this place. But for now, it's time for the next project. I hope you found this breakdown useful, and thank you for listening until the end. And if you have any questions or feedback, feel free to contact me via ArtStation.